He just wanted to get his daughter through another week without the lights flickering off. But when he found the lost dog with the $1,000 collar, he never imagined the reclusive owner who came to claim it would be the one to turn his broken world back on. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching? From the Wind was a thief that morning. Stealing the last of the warmth from the cracked window frames of their third-floor apartment and leaving a chill that settled deep in Leo's bones, he stood at the kitchen sink, one hand wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm water. The coffee had run out on Tuesday, but the ritual felt necessary, a small act of normalcy in a life that was fraying at the seams. Outside the sky was a flat, unforgiving gray pressing down on the narrow streets of a town that had long forgotten how to thrive. His daughter Maya sat at the small kitchen table, her head bent in concentration, a halo of messy brown hair catching the weak light as she drew on a piece of scrap paper he'd salvaged from the back of a junk mail envelope. She was humming, a tuneless melody, a sound so pure and unburdened it was a stark contrast to the quiet panic humming in Leo's own chest. The eviction notice was still tucked under the fruit bowl, a folded square of paper that felt heavier than a brick. He had 2 weeks' rent was a number he couldn't even begin to form in his head. His last carpentry job had fallen through the client, claiming they'd found someone cheaper, leaving Leo with a half-finished cabinet and a stack of invoices that were now just reminders of failure. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching against his calloused skin. He was a man who built things for a living, shelves, tables, homes. But he couldn't seem to build a stable foundation for his own daughter. He looked over at Maya, her crayon moving with fierce determination, and felt the familiar ache of love and fear twist in his gut. She was 8 years old and the only perfect thing he'd ever made. She deserved more than this, more than a father who measured their future in slices of bread and overdue bills. "Daddy, can we go for a walk later?" she asked without looking up. "I want to find some more shiny rocks for my collection." Leo forced a smile. "Yeah, kiddo. After breakfast, we'll go exploring." He turned back to the sink, his reflection in the window, a tired stranger he didn't recognize. He had $94 to his name, $94 to stretch across food, gas, and a miracle. But for Maya, he would walk to the ends of the earth to find a few shiny rocks. The park was mostly empty, just a few scattered leaves skittering across the pavement and the distant mournful cry of a train whistle. It was the kind of place that was beautiful in its decay, with worn wooden benches and a swing set that groaned with every push. Leo sat on one of those benches, watching Maya hunt for treasure near the overgrown rose bushes. Her laughter was the only color in the gray afternoon, and he held onto the sound like a lifeline. A small flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold, that's when he saw it, a flash of gold against the brown grass. At first he thought it was a fox, but as it trotted closer he realized it was a dog. A golden retriever with fur so clean and bright it seemed to glow. Against the muted backdrop of the park, its gait was nervous, its head low, as if it were looking for something. It had lost. Maya spotted it a second later and her eyes went wide. "Daddy, look," she whispered, pointing with a mitten-clad hand. The dog stopped a few yards away, its tail giving a tentative wag. It was wearing a collar, a simple band of dark leather, but something about it looked expensive the way it was stitched. The small silver tag that glinted in the dim light. It whimpered softly, a sound that went straight to Leo's heart. "Stay here," he said to Maya. Standing slowly, he moved toward the dog. His steps measured, his voice low. "Hey there, buddy, you lost." He knelt down, extending a hand, palm up. The dog hesitated, then took a hesitant step forward, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air around him. There was no aggression in its eyes, just a deep, profound sadness. Leo had seen that look before in the mirror. He finally reached the dog and gently took hold of its collar. The leather was soft, supple. The tag wasn't a cheap aluminum disc from a pet store vending machine. It was thick, polished steel, engraved with a single word, Orion, and a phone number underneath. No name, no address, just a quiet statement of value. Leo sighed, running a hand over the dog's head. Its fur was like silk. He looked back at Maya, who was watching with bated breath, her small face a mixture of hope and concern. "Well, Orion," he muttered, "let's see if we can get you home." The dog licked his hand once, a gesture of trust that felt both welcome and undeserved. Leo knew he should just call the number. Get this over with, but a part of him dreaded it. A dog this well cared for belonged to a world he didn't, a world where lost things were found with rewards and relief, not with the quiet gnawing fear of what came next. For now, though, he just sat there on the cold ground with a lost dog and a daughter who was already falling in love, and for a brief moment the weight on his shoulders felt a little bit lighter. Maya named him Buddy before they even made it back to the apartment. Leo had tried to explain that the dog already had a name, Orion. But Maya insisted that was his fancy name, and Buddy was his friend name. The dog seemed to agree, trotting beside her with a new sense of purpose, his tail no longer tucked in, fear but wagging in a steady, hopeful rhythm. Leo watched them, his heart in his throat. He knew this was temporary, a fleeting moment of joy before reality came crashing back in, but seeing the way Maya's eyes lit up as she whispered secrets into the dog's ear made it impossible to rush back at the apartment. The dog settled onto the worn rug by the couch as if it had lived there its whole life. It didn't bark, it didn't pace, it just watched them with intelligent amber eyes, a quiet observer. In their small, chaotic world, Leo pulled out his phone, the silver tag cool against his palm. He stared at the number for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct told him to wait, to let Maya have this. For just one more hour, one more evening, but he knew that would only make it harder. He took a deep breath and dialed the phone. Rang once, twice. A third time he was about to hang up, convinced it was a disconnected number when a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, low and calm, but with an undercurrent of something else, tension, maybe, or exhaustion. "Hello?" she said. Leo cleared his throat, his own voice sounding rougher than he expected. "Hi, I think I have your dog." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Orion?" she asked, her voice now laced with a desperate hope that cut through the calm facade. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," Leo said quickly. "He's right here safe. We found him at the park." The relief in her exhale was audible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. Where are you? I can be there in 20 minutes. Leo gave her the address of a small coffee shop a few blocks away, a neutral public space that felt safer than his own fragile home. He didn't want her to see the peeling paint on his door or the faint scent of worry that clung to the hallway. He wanted to hand over the dog, collect a polite thank you, and disappear back into the anonymity of his own life. "I'll meet you there," she said, her voice steadier now, more composed. "I can't thank you enough." After he hung up, he looked over at Maya. She was sitting on the floor beside the dog, her arm draped over its back, her cheek resting on its golden fur. She looked up at him, her eyes already knowing, his mom is coming, isn't she? Leo nodded slowly. "Yeah, kiddo, his mom is coming." He braced himself for tears, for a tantrum. But Maya just gave a small, solemn nod and hugged the dog tighter. "Okay," she whispered into its fur. At least we got to be his friend for a little while, and the quiet maturity in her voice broke Leo's heart. More than any outburst ever could, the coffee shop buzzed with the low hum of afternoon chatter, the air thick with the scent of burnt espresso and cinnamon. Leo sat at a small table near the window, one hand wrapped around a cup of black coffee. He couldn't afford, but had bought anyway, just to have a reason to be there. Buddy lay at his feet, his head resting on Leo's worn work boots, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the leg of the table. Maya sat opposite him, her hot chocolate untouched as she stared out the window. Watching every car that passed, Leo had chosen this place for its anonymity, but now it felt too bright, too exposed. He felt the familiar prickle of inadequacy crawl up his spine. He was wearing his cleanest flannel, but it still had a small paint stain on the cuff. His jeans were worn thin at the knees, and his hands, no matter how much he scrubbed, could never fully shed the evidence of his work. The calluses, the faint lines of grease etched into his skin. He didn't belong in a world where people owned dogs that looked like they'd just stepped out of a shampoo commercial. Then a car pulled up to the curb, a sleek black sedan so polished it reflected the gray sky like a dark mirror. It wasn't flashy, but it was expensive in a way that didn't need to announce itself. The door opened, and she stepped out. Leo's breath caught. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple pair of dark jeans, a gray cashmere sweater, and a tailored wool coat. Her hair was pulled back into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, and her face was bare of makeup, but she still possessed a kind of quiet elegance that made her stand out. She moved with a grace that felt both natural and practiced, like someone who was used to being watched but had learned to pretend she wasn't. She paused on the sidewalk, her eyes scanning the coffee shop window, and for a second their gazes met. Through the glass he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Relief, yes, but also a deep weariness, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with her polished appearance. She pushed the door open, the little bell above it chiming softly. Buddy's head shot up, and he let out a soft whine, his tail now a blur of motion. "Orion," she said, her voice soft and full of emotion. She knelt down, and the dog was in her arms in an instant, burying his head in her coat, his whole body trembling with joy. Leo stood slowly, Maya still frozen in her seat. She watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she finally turned to Leo, her eyes full of a quiet awe that had nothing to do with the expensive car or the cashmere coat. She's his mom, he thought, and somehow that was more than enough. The reunion was a whirlwind of soft words and gentle touches. Clara didn't sob or make a scene, she just held onto the dog, her eyes closed as if she were anchoring herself to the one solid thing in her world. Leo and Maya stood back, giving her the space she needed. It felt like intruding on a private moment. A quiet prayer answered. After a long moment she finally stood, brushing a stray golden hair from her coat. She turned to Leo, her eyes still shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Leo just shook his head. "I'm glad he's safe, that's all that matters." "It is," she said, "but you did more than just find him. You kept him safe, you were kind." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a slim leather wallet from it. She withdrew a thick stack of $100 bills and held them out to him. "Please," she said, "take this. It's the least I can do." Leo looked at the money, then back at her, and something inside him recoiled. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was something deeper, an instinct to protect the one thing he had left, his integrity. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't take that." Clara blinked clearly, taken aback. "But you deserve it. You found my dog." "I didn't do it for a reward," Leo said, meeting her gaze. "I did it because he was lost, and my daughter fell in love with him for an hour. That's enough." He could see the confusion in her eyes, the way she struggled to process his refusal. People in her world didn't turn down money. They negotiated for more. They leveraged kindness for gain. His simple rejection had thrown her off balance. He saw her glance at his worn boots, at the frayed collar of his shirt, and he knew she was thinking he was a fool, but he didn't care. Maya finally slid out of her chair and walked over to the dog. She patted his head gently. "Bye, buddy," she whispered. Clara looked down at her, then back at Leo, a new expression dawning on her face, something close to respect, maybe even awe. She slowly tucked the money back into her wallet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to offend you." Leo nodded, accepting the unspoken apology. "It's okay." As she turned to leave her dog trotting happily at her side, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "My name is Clara," she said, "and I owe you more than I can say." With that she was gone, the bell chiming her exit, leaving Leo and Maya in a silence that felt both empty and full. He looked down at his daughter, who was staring at the door with a small, sad smile on her face. "She was nice, Daddy," Maya said quietly. "Yeah, kiddo, he," replied, his hand resting on her head. "She was." And as he watched the black sedan pull away from the curb, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered something far more valuable and far more complicated than a lost dog. The apartment felt colder and quieter. After they got back, the absence of the dog was a tangible thing, a hollow space on the rug where he'd lain, a silence. Where the soft thump of his tail had been, Maya was subdued. She didn't cry, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She sat on her bed with her drawing pad sketching a golden retriever with a crooked smile and a halo of stars around its head. Leo watched her from the doorway, his heart a dull ache in his chest. He had done the right thing, the only thing. But it didn't feel good. It felt like he had taken something precious away from her, not just the dog, but the brief, magical belief that good things could just appear in their lives without a price tag attached. He walked into the kitchen and stared at the eviction notice still tucked under the fruit bowl. The $94 in his wallet felt like a joke, a cruel reminder of how close to the edge they were living. Clara's offered reward flashed in his mind, a thick stack of bills that could have solved everything. Rent, food, the busted heater in the living room. It could have bought them time, a month, maybe 2, a world of breathing room, but he couldn't have taken it. Not then, not ever. Taking her money would have felt like admitting that his kindness had a price, that his integrity was for sale, and that was the one thing he refused to let the world take from him. He ran a hand through his hair, leaning against the counter as the weight of it all pressed down on him. He was a good man, a good father, but goodness didn't pay the bills. It didn't fix a broken world or mend a little girl's quiet heartbreak. He heard a soft sniffle from the other room and went to Maya's side. She looked up from her drawing, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Leo sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her into a hug, his own throat tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but I'm glad we got to meet him, aren't you?" Maya nodded, burying her face in his shirt. "Me too." He held her for a long time, the scent of her shampoo and the warmth of her small body, a fragile anchor in the storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't have a plan or a solution, but as he held his daughter, he knew one thing for certain: he would not let them break. He would find a way. Somehow, he always did. 2 days passed in a haze of gray skies and quiet desperation. Leo spent the hours scouring online job boards, calling old contacts, and taking on a small repair job that paid just enough to cover groceries for the week. It was a temporary fix, a bandage on a wound that needed stitches. He felt like he was treading water in an ocean of debt. Each small effort keeping his head above the surface for a moment before the next wave threatened to pull him under. Maya was his lighthouse, his one point of focus in the storm. She didn't mention the dog again, but he saw the drawing of Buddy taped to her wall, a silent tribute to their brief four-legged friend on the third day, as Leo was sanding down a piece of reclaimed oak in his small, makeshift workshop. In the corner of the living room, a knock came at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and peered through the peephole, his heart lurching, when he saw who it was. Clara. She stood in the hallway, her hands clutching the strap of a leather satchel. Her expression was hesitant, uncertain. She was dressed more casually this time, in a simple black coat and boots, but she still looked like she belonged to another world, a world of clean lines and quiet confidence. Leo opened the door slowly, the chain still latched. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice more guarded than he intended. Clara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, "but I was in the neighborhood and I wanted to." She trailed off as if unsure how to finish her sentence. "You wanted to what?" Leo asked, his hand still on the door. Clara took a small breath. "I wanted to see if you would be willing to build something for me." Leo blinked. "Build something?" "A bookshelf," she said, "a small one. For my study. I saw the woodworking tools when you opened the door the other day, and I remembered seeing some of your work online a while back. You're Leo Thorne, the carpenter, right?" He was stunned. She knew his name, his work. He had a small online portfolio, a collection of photos of tables and chairs he'd built years ago when he still had a proper shop and a steady stream of clients. He hadn't updated it in over a year. "I am," he said slowly, "but I don't really take on commissions like that anymore." "Please," she said, her voice soft but persistent. "I'd pay you for your time. Of course, I wouldn't take no for an answer this time." Her eyes held his, and he saw something there that wasn't pity or charity. It was a genuine request, a lifeline disguised as a piece of furniture. He hesitated for a long moment, the rational part of his brain screaming that this was a mistake, that letting her into his world would only lead to more complications. But then he thought of the eviction notice, of the look in Maya's eyes, and the $94 that were now down to $63. He slowly unlatched the chain and opened the door. "Come in," he said. "Let's talk about the bookshelf." The apartment felt smaller. With Clara in it, her presence seemed to take up all the air, filling the spaces where dust and silence usually resided. She stood near the doorway, her eyes taking in everything, the worn furniture, the stack of library books on the coffee table, the faint scent of sawdust that clung to the air. She didn't wrinkle her nose or cast a judgmental glance. Instead, she looked at the half-finished cabinet in the corner. A piece of intricate woodwork Leo had been forced to abandon. "Is this yours?" she asked, her fingers ghosting over the carved details. Leo nodded. It was a commission client backed out. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with a genuine admiration that caught him off guard. People didn't usually notice the details, the way the grain of the wood was matched, the smoothness of the finish. They just saw a piece of furniture, but she saw the craft, the artistry. Maya peeked her head out from her bedroom, her eyes widening when she saw their visitor. "It's the dog's mom," she whispered to Leo, loud enough for Clara to hear. A small smile touched Clara's lips. "You can just call me Clara," she said gently to Maya. "And this is for you." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, not the cheap waxy kind from the dollar store, but artist-grade pencils in a rainbow of rich hues. Maya's face lit up like a Roman candle. "Wow," she breathed, taking the gift with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "Thank you." Clara's smile deepened. "I thought a fellow artist should have the right tools." Leo watched the exchange, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sputtering heater in the corner. He had expected her to be awkward or condescending, but she wasn't. She spoke to Maya not as a child to be placated, but as an equal, a peer. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it meant the world. They spent the next hour discussing the bookshelf. Clara had a clear vision, a simple design with clean lines and a dark stain that would complement the books she collected. She didn't haggle on the price or question his process. She just listened, nodding as he sketched out a rough design on a piece of scrapwood. "I'll need a deposit for the materials," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Of course," Clara replied without hesitation. She wrote him a check for an amount that was more than generous enough to cover the wood, the stain, and a full month's rent. He stared at the number for a long moment, his throat tight. "This is too much," he said. "It's what your work is worth," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "I'll be in town for a while," she said, "so just let me know when it's ready." Leo just nodded. Unable to find the words to thank her after she was gone, he stood in the quiet of his apartment, the check in his hand, feeling both like a lifeline and a weight. He didn't know what game she was playing or why she had sought him out. But for the first time in a long time, he had a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Hope, the scent of freshly cut pine, filled the small apartment, a clean, earthy fragrance that temporarily overpowered the ever-present smell of dust and worry. Leo had turned his living room into a makeshift workshop, a tarp spread over the floor and his tools laid out in neat, organized rows. He worked with a focused intensity that bordered on obsession, every cut precise, every joint seamless. This bookshelf wasn't just a commission, it was a test, a chance to prove to himself and to the mysterious woman who had appeared in his life that he was still the craftsman he used to be. He lost track of time, the days blurring into a rhythm of sawing, sanding, and staining. Maya would sit on the couch after school doing her homework and watching him. Her quiet presence, a steady anchor in his storm of concentration, she'd occasionally offer him a glass of water or a cookie, a silent gesture of support that he cherished more than words. One afternoon, as he was applying the final coat of stain, a soft knock came at the door. It was Clara she was holding, 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag that smelled of cinnamon. "Peace offering," she said, with a smile. "I figured you might be running on fumes." Leo wiped his hands on a rag, a faint smile touching his own lips. "You figured right." He stepped aside to let her in, and her eyes immediately went to the bookshelf. It stood in the center of the room, its dark wood gleaming under the single overhead light, its lines clean and elegant, just as she had described Leo. She breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's perfect." "It's not done yet," he said quickly, deflecting the praise. "I still need to let it cure and then deliver it." "It's more than I imagined," she said, walking around it. Her fingers tracing the smooth surface, she looked at him, then her expression serious. "You have a gift, you know that." Leo just shrugged. "I'm just a guy who likes working with wood." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's more than that. You see the beauty in things that other people discard. You give them a new life, a new purpose." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with an unspoken meaning that had nothing to do with furniture. He didn't know how to respond to that kind of observation, so he just took the coffee she offered, their fingers brushing as he did. The touch was brief, electric, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the hot cup in his hand. She didn't pull away immediately, and in that small moment of shared silence, he realized that this wasn't just about a bookshelf anymore. It was about 2 people from different worlds finding a common language in the grain of a piece of wood. The bookshelf was finished, a silent testament to Leo's skill and dedication. It stood in the corner of his living room, waiting to be delivered, its dark cherry stain glowing with a depth that seemed to absorb the light in the room. It was the best thing he had built in years, and the thought of letting it go filled him with a strange mixture of pride and reluctance. He had called Clara the day before to let her know it was ready, and she had insisted on coming to pick it up herself. "I've got a truck," she'd said, her voice warm over the phone, "and I want to see Maya again." Leo had agreed, his heart doing a nervous flip-flop that he tried to ignore. Now he was pacing his small apartment, tidying things that were already tidy, and trying to calm the swarm of butterflies in his stomach. He didn't understand why he was so nervous. He was just a carpenter delivering a piece of furniture. But it felt like more. It felt like an ending or a beginning, and he wasn't sure which one scared him more when she arrived. She wasn't alone. Buddy, the golden retriever, bounded out of the truck as soon as she opened the door, his tail a blur of happy motion. He ran straight to Maya, who squealed with delight and dropped to her knees to hug him. "You brought him," she cried, her face buried in his fur. Clara smiled, watching them. "I thought he might have missed his new best friend." Leo stood in the doorway, his hands stuffed in his pockets, trying to look casual, but his heart was pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. "The bookshelf is ready," he said, gesturing inside. Clara's eyes widened as she stepped into the apartment. "Leo, it's even more beautiful in the light." She walked over to it, her movements full of a quiet reverence that made him feel both proud and exposed. "You're a true artist," she said. Turning to him, her gaze intense, Leo just shook his head. "It's just a bookshelf." "It's not," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's a piece of you, it's honest and strong, and it doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." Her words were a balm to his bruised ego, a validation he hadn't realized he was craving. They loaded the bookshelf into her truck, a careful dance of lifting and sliding, their hands brushing more than once in the process, each touch a small jolt of electricity that lingered long after it was gone. As she was about to leave, she paused, her hand on the truck door. "I'm having a small get-together at my place tomorrow night," she said, her eyes not quite meeting his. "A housewarming of sorts. It's nothing fancy, just a few friends. I'd like it if you and Maya could come." Leo's stomach did a nervous lurch. "I don't know, Clara. We don't really." "Please," she interrupted, her voice earnest. "It would mean a lot to me." He looked at Maya, who was still playing with Buddy, her face a picture of pure joy. And he knew he couldn't say no. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll be there." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face, and for the first time Leo allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a game at all. Maybe it was something real. The address Clara had given him wasn't for a house. It was for an estate, the kind of place that had a name, not just a number on the gate. A long, winding driveway snaked through a forest of tall pines, leading to a sprawling stone and glass structure that seemed to grow out of the hillside. It was modern and minimalist, but a warm light glowed from within, making it look less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. Leo pulled his beat-up sedan to a stop in front of the massive wooden doors, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He was wearing his only suit, a charcoal gray relic from a lifetime ago. It was clean and pressed, but it felt like a costume. He looked over at Maya in the passenger seat. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one with the sparkles on the collar, and she was clutching a small wrapped gift in her hands, a framed drawing of Buddy she had made for Clara. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice tight. She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and awe. "It looks like a castle, Daddy." "Yeah, kiddo, it kind of does." He took a deep breath and turned off the engine. Every instinct was screaming at him to turn around to drive away from this world of wealth and privilege that he could never be a part of. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't a man who broke his promises. They walked up the stone path to the front door, their footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. Before he could even knock, the door swung open and Clara stood there. She was wearing a simple black dress that fell to her knees. Her hair was down in soft waves, and her smile was genuine and welcoming. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her eyes shining. She knelt down to Maya's level. "And who is this beautiful princess?" Maya giggled and held out the gift. "It's for you." Clara took it with a soft thank you, her gaze lingering on the small, clumsily wrapped package. As if it were the most precious thing in the world, she led them inside, and Leo's breath caught in his throat. The interior was as stunning as the exterior, a soaring ceiling, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a breathtaking view of the city lights and a collection of modern art that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. A few people milled about, sipping wine and chatting in low voices. They were all impeccably dressed, their laughter soft and refined. Leo felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over him. He was a carpenter, a man of sawdust and calluses, and he was standing in a room full of people who probably didn't even know how to hold a hammer. Clara must have sensed his discomfort because she gently touched his arm, her touch a small anchor in the storm of his insecurity. "Don't worry about them," she whispered, her voice for his ears. The only person I wanted here tonight was you." The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines, polished concrete, and glass walls that seemed to erase the boundary between inside and out. Every piece of furniture, every work of art, every carefully chosen object screamed of wealth and taste. Leo felt like he was walking through a museum, not a home. He clutched his glass of sparkling water, his hand so tight he was afraid it might shatter. He watched Maya from across the room. She was sitting on a plush white rug with Buddy, her head bent in serious conversation with the dog, oblivious to the quiet scrutiny of the other guests. Clara had introduced him to a few of her friends, a gallery owner, a software developer, a celebrated architect. They were all polite, charming, and utterly inscrutable. Their questions were veiled, their compliments double-edged. They looked at him with a kind of detached curiosity, as if he were a strange new piece of art Clara had acquired. He could feel their judgment, a cold and subtle thing that slid under his skin and made him feel small and out of place. He was the carpenter, the charity case, the man who had stumbled into a world where he didn't belong. He was about to make his excuses and leave when a man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit approached him. His smile was smooth and practiced, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "You must be Leo," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Marcus Thorne, Clara's business manager." Leo shook his hand, his own feeling rough and calloused. In comparison, "Nice to meet you." Marcus's gaze flickered over Leo's suit, taking in the slightly worn fabric and the outdated cut. "Clara has told me so much about you," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending sweetness. "She has a soft spot for strays." The insult was a stiletto to the ribs, sharp and precise. Leo's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "And you must be the one who keeps the leash," he replied, his voice low and steady. Marcus's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes before he recovered. "Clara is a valuable asset," he said. "It's my job to protect her from unwise investments." The implication was clear. Leo was an unwise investment, a liability, a risk that needed to be managed. He was about to respond when Clara appeared at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Marcus," she said, her voice cool and cutting, "I believe Leo and I were just about to get some fresh air." She steered him toward the glass doors that led to the terrace, her grip firm and protective as they stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled below them, a sea of distant stars. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice full of a quiet fury. "I should have known he would do that." Leo just shook his head. "It's not your fault. He's just a man who's afraid of losing his grip." "He's a snake," she said, "and he's not the only one in there." She looked at him, then her eyes searching his face. "You don't have to stay. You can leave right now, and I would completely understand." He looked back at her, at the way the moonlight caught in her hair, at the fire in her eyes, and he realized that he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to run away from this world or the people in it. He wanted to stand beside her and fight. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm and clear, "unless you are." And in the quiet of that moment, under the vast and star-filled sky, he knew that he was no longer just a carpenter who had found a lost dog. He was a man who had found something worth fighting for. The terrace was a quiet sanctuary away from the polished conversations and veiled judgments. Inside, the air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant hum of the city. Leo and Clara stood by the railing, their hands still linked, a silent declaration of solidarity in a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. He looked out at the sprawling vista of lights, a glittering tapestry that stretched to the horizon. "This is your life," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "All of this." Clara followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It's a gilded cage," she said, her voice soft and tinged with a sadness that he was beginning to understand. "It looks beautiful from the outside, but it's still a cage." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "I spent years playing the part my parents wanted me to play. The dutiful daughter, the brilliant businesswoman, the perfect hostess. I built an empire, but I lost myself in the process." She paused, her thumb tracing a light pattern on the back of his hand. "Then I lost Orion, and, in a strange way, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It led me to you." Leo's heart tightened in his chest. He had never been anyone's destination. He was always the rest stop, the temporary fix, the man people left behind. "I'm just a carpenter, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't give you any of this." "I don't want this," she said, her voice fierce. I want what you have. I want the sawdust and the calluses and the burnt grilled cheese. I want the quiet moments and the honest conversations. I want the love you have for Maya, a love that isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly reports." She stepped closer, her body almost brushing against his. "You think you're the one who's out of place here," she whispered, "but you're the only real thing in this entire house." The words were a key turning in a lock he had long forgotten existed, a lock on a part of his heart he had thought was permanently closed. He looked into her eyes and saw not a billionaire heiress, but a woman who was just as lost and just as scared as he was. And in that moment he knew that he was falling in love with her, not for her money or her status, but for the beautiful broken pieces of her soul that she had been brave enough to show him. He lifted his free hand and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't even know she had shed. "You're not a stray," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You're home." And then he kissed her, a slow and tender kiss that was a promise, a prayer, and a declaration of a love that was as real and as solid as the wood he carved with his own two hands. The party was winding down, the guests departing in a slow stream of luxury cars and polite goodbyes, leaving behind a trail of half-empty wine glasses and the faint echo of manufactured laughter. Leo and Clara stood in the now quiet living room, the city lights a silent witness to the new world they had just created. Maya was asleep on the plush white couch, her head in Clara's lap, and Buddy was curled up at her feet, a furry guardian in her dreams. Leo looked at the scene before him, a domestic tableau so perfect it almost felt like a dream, and he felt a pang of fear, a familiar ghost from his past. What if this wasn't real? What if he woke up tomorrow and it was all gone? Clara seemed to sense his unease, her eyes soft and knowing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice a gentle whisper. He sat down on the edge of the couch, his hand resting on Maya's small back. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, his voice low. "I'm not used to things being this good." "Me neither," she said, her fingers stroking Maya's hair. "I've spent my whole life being told that love is a transaction, a negotiation, a means to an end. But with you, it's different. It's quiet and steady, and it doesn't ask for anything in return." She looked at him, then, her gaze unwavering. "I'm scared too, Leo. I'm scared of messing this up, of hurting you and Maya, of not being the person you think I am." "You are the person I think you are," he said, his voice firm. "You're the woman who knelt on a coffee shop floor to hug her lost dog. You're the woman who saw the art in a half-finished cabinet, and you're the woman who stood up to a room full of sharks to defend a man she barely knew." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I don't care about the money or the house or the fancy friends. I care about you, Clara, the real you." A tear slid down her cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. "No one has ever seen me like that before," she whispered. "No one has ever even tried." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the soft breathing of their sleeping daughter. The city lights twinkled on, and the moon cast a silvery glow on the floor. It was a moment of perfect peace, a fragile bubble of hope in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. Leo knew that there would be challenges ahead. There would be obstacles and judgments, and people like Marcus who would try to tear them apart. But as he looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had seen the king and the carpenter, he knew that they would face it all together, because they had found something rare and precious, something that was worth fighting for. They had found a love that was built not on wealth or status, but on the solid foundation of two hearts that had finally found their way home, the morning after the party broke with a soft, golden light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the living room in hues of hope and new beginnings. Leo woke up on the couch, his neck stiff and his suit jacket crumpled, but his heart was full. He had fallen asleep with his head on Clara's shoulder, a position that felt both strange and wonderfully familiar. He sat up and looked around the room. Clara was in the kitchen, her back to him, humming softly as she made. Coffee. Maya was still asleep on the other end of the couch, her small face peaceful and serene. It was a scene of domestic bliss so perfect it made his chest ache. He stood up and walked over to the kitchen, his footsteps silent on the polished concrete floor. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Clara turned and smiled a genuine radiant smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Good morning to you, too," she said, handing him a mug of coffee. "I was just about to wake you. I thought we could have breakfast on the terrace." Leo took the coffee, their fingers brushing in a now familiar dance of gentle electricity. "I should probably get Maya home," he said, his voice hesitant. "She has school tomorrow." "I know," Clara said, her smile not faltering, "but I was hoping you might stay for a little while longer. I could have my driver take her to school in the morning." The offer was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took Leo a moment to process it. A driver, a private school, a world of effortless convenience that was so far removed from his own reality, he was about to refuse to retreat back into the familiar comfort of his own struggles. When he looked at Maya's sleeping face, she looked so peaceful, so safe, so at home in this place of quiet luxury, and he realized that he couldn't deny her this moment of grace. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll stay." They ate breakfast on the terrace, the sun warm on their faces, and the city spread out below them like a kingdom at their feet. They talked about everything and nothing, their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. It was a conversation so honest and so real that it felt like they had known each other for a lifetime. After breakfast, Clara took them on a tour of the estate, the sprawling gardens, the serene koi pond, the state-of-the-art home gym. Maya was in heaven, her eyes wide with wonder at every new discovery, but Leo felt a growing sense of unease. He was a man who worked with his hands, a man who found beauty in the simple and the humble, and this world of opulent excess felt both seductive and suffocating. He was standing by the edge of the infinity pool, looking out at the endless blue of the water, when Clara came up behind him, her hand resting lightly on his back. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "I don't belong here, Clara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "This isn't my world." "It doesn't have to be," she said, her voice firm. "We can create our own world, Leo, a world that is a blend of both of ours. A world where a carpenter and an heiress can build a life together." She turned him to face her, her eyes searching his. "I love you, Leo Thorne," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you for your kindness, your strength, your integrity. I love you for the man you are not the man you think you should be." The words were a tidal wave that washed over him, sweeping away the last of his doubts and fears. He looked into her eyes and saw his own love reflected back at him, a love that was as deep and as vast as the sky above them. "I love you too, Clara," he said. His voice choked with a happiness he had never thought he would feel again, and as he pulled her into his arms, he knew that he had finally found his true north, his safe harbor, his forever home. They spent the rest of the day in a blissful bubble of love and laughter. They played with Buddy. In the garden they swam in the pool, they read stories to Maya in the library. It was a day of simple joys, a day that felt like a lifetime of happiness packed into a few precious hours as the sun began to set. They sat on the terrace watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep indigo. The city lights began to twinkle on, one by one, a magical display that mirrored the light in their own hearts. "I have an idea," Clara said, her voice soft and thoughtful. "An idea that could change everything." Leo looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "I want to start a foundation," she said, her eyes shining with a newfound purpose. "A foundation that helps struggling artists and craftsmen like you, people who have a gift but lack the resources to share it with the world. We could provide them with grants, with studio space, with a platform to showcase their work. We could call it the Thorne Foundation." Leo was speechless. The idea was so audacious, so generous, so quintessentially Clara that it took his breath away. "You would do that?" he asked, his voice full, of a mixture of awe and disbelief. "For me?" "For us," she said, her hand finding his in the twilight. for all the people out there who are just waiting for someone to believe in them. It was a crazy idea, a beautiful, impossible dream, but as he looked into her eyes, he knew that with her anything was possible. They would build this foundation together. They would build a life together. They would build a future that was as strong and as beautiful as the love that had brought them together. It was a future that was born from a lost dog, a chance encounter, and a love that had defied all odds. It was a future that was written in the stars and carved in the grain of their hearts. The news of Clara's foundation spread like wildfire through the city, a feel-good story that captured the public's imagination. The reclusive billionaire heiress who had turned her back on the corporate world to champion the cause of the struggling artist. It was a narrative so compelling, so romantic, that it became the talk of the town. Reporters clamored for interviews, philanthropists pledged their support, and the art world buzzed with anticipation. But Clara remained elusive. She declined all requests for interviews. She refused to be photographed. She let the work of the foundation speak for itself. She and Leo worked tirelessly behind the scenes, building the foundation from the ground up. They rented a small office in a nondescript building in the heart of the city, a space that was a far cry from the opulent headquarters of her father's empire, but it was a space that was filled with purpose and passion. They hired a small team of dedicated individuals who shared their vision, and they began the process of sifting through hundreds of applications from artists and craftsmen from all walks of life. It was a daunting task, but it was also incredibly rewarding. They discovered a wealth of hidden talent, a community of creative souls who were just waiting for a chance to shine. One day, as they were reviewing a portfolio from a young sculptor who worked with reclaimed metal, Leo came across a familiar name, Marcus Thorne. His first instinct was to discard the application, to dismiss it as a cynical attempt to get back into Clara's good graces. But then he looked closer at the photos of the sculptures. They were raw and powerful, full of a desperate beauty that spoke of a man who was struggling to find his voice. He showed the portfolio to Clara without comment. She studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice neutral. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a quiet wisdom. "I think everyone deserves a second chance," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Even the snakes." They awarded Marcus the grant, and a few weeks later he sent them a handwritten note of thanks. It was a simple note, devoid of the usual corporate jargon and veiled compliments. It was a note from a man who had been humbled by grace, a man who was finally ready to create something real. The Thorne Foundation became a beacon of hope in a city that was often cynical and jaded. It was a testament to the power of love, of kindness, of believing in the potential of the human spirit. It was a legacy that Leo and Clara built together, a legacy that was far more valuable than any inheritance or stock portfolio. It was a legacy of love, a legacy of hope, a legacy that would continue to inspire and uplift for generations to come. The workshop was a beautiful, chaotic mess. Sawdust covered the floor like a fine layer of snow. The scent of freshly cut wood hung in the air, and the sound of a power sander whirred in the background. Leo stood at his workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration, as he put the finishing touches on a hand-carved rocking horse. It was a gift for Maya's 9th birthday, a labor of love that had taken him weeks to complete. The door to the workshop opened, and Clara walked in carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of warm croissants. She was wearing a pair of old jeans and one of Leo's flannel shirts, and she looked more beautiful to him than she ever had in her designer dresses and cashmere sweaters. "Break time," she said, her voice full of a playful authority. He turned off the sander and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "You're a lifesaver," he said, his voice full of a genuine gratitude that still made her heart skip a beat. They sat on a pair of wooden stools, their legs brushing, as they sipped their coffee and shared a croissant. The workshop was their sanctuary, their shared space, a place where they could be themselves without the pressures and expectations of the outside world. It was a place where a carpenter and an heiress could be just a man and a woman in love. "I was thinking," Clara said, her voice soft and thoughtful, "that we should take a trip, a real vacation, just the three of us." Leo looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere you want," she said, her eyes shining. "The mountains, the beach, a quiet little town where no one knows our names." It was a tempting offer, a chance to escape the whirlwind of their new life, to reconnect with the simple joys that had brought them together. But Leo knew that they didn't need to go anywhere to find their happiness. They had already found it right here in this messy, beautiful workshop, in the quiet moments and the shared dreams. "We don't need to go anywhere," he said, his voice full of a quiet certainty. "We're already home." Clara smiled, her heart overflowing with a love that was as deep and as vast as the sky. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow and tender kiss that was a promise, a prayer, and a declaration of a love that was as real and as solid as the wood he carved with his own two hands. They had found their happily ever after, not in a castle or a boardroom, but in the simple, ordinary magic of a life built on love, trust, and the courage to believe in second chances. It was a love story for the ages, a story that would be whispered in the quiet corners of the city, a story that would remind everyone that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in the grand gestures, but in the gentle whispers of a heart that has finally found its way home. Years later. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Leo and Maya sat on the porch of their small country house, a cozy little cottage nestled in a valley of rolling hills and golden meadows. The Thorn Foundation had become a resounding success, a self-sustaining organization that was run by a dedicated team of professionals, leaving Leo and Clara free to pursue their own passions. Leo had opened a small woodworking school, teaching a new generation of craftsmen the art of his trade. Clara had become a patron of the arts, using her wealth and influence to support emerging artists and create a more vibrant and inclusive cultural landscape. They had built a life that was a beautiful blend of their two worlds, a life that was rich in love, laughter, and purpose. Maya was a young woman now, her eyes full of the same fire and intelligence as her mother's, and her heart full of the same kindness and compassion as her father's. She was an aspiring writer, her stories filled with the magic and wonder of the world around her. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked her father, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet afternoon. "The city, the excitement, the roar of the crowd." Leo smiled a gentle, knowing smile. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then, I look around at all of this." He gestured to the golden valley, the whispering trees, the quiet beauty of their home. "And I realize that I have everything I ever wanted right here." Clara walked out onto the porch carrying a tray with 3 mugs of hot apple cider. She sat down beside them, her hand finding Leo's in a gesture of easy intimacy. "What are you two talking about?" she asked, her voice full of a warm curiosity. "We were just talking about how a lost dog changed our lives forever," Maya said, her eyes twinkling with a mischievous light. Clara laughed a sound that was as clear and as bright as a mountain stream. "He was a very special dog," she said. "He knew that we were all just a little bit lost, and he helped us find our way back to each other." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, sipping their cider and watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was a canvas of brilliant colors, a masterpiece of nature's art that mirrored the beauty of their own lives. It was a life that was built on the foundation of a love that had defied all odds, a love that was as strong and as enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. It was a love that was a testament to the power of kindness, of compassion, of believing in the magic of second chances. It was a love that was a legacy, a gift, a beautiful and timeless story that would be passed down through generations, a story of a carpenter, a princess, and a very wise dog who knew that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a simple act of kindness and a heart that is open to the possibility of a miracle.